The inheritance was not one of wealth, but of dust and whispers. Elara Vance ran a gloved finger over the lid of the small, salt-stained wooden box her grandmother had left her. It had sat in her London flat for weeks, an unassuming relic amidst the stacks of research papers and academic journals that defined her life as a historical consultant. Her grandmother had always been a woman of quiet faith and even quieter stories, and this box felt like her final, unspoken sentence. Inside, nestled amongst faded photographs and a string of cloudy amber beads, was a letter. The envelope was brittle, the ink a ghostly brown against the yellowed paper. It was addressed to no one, and the postmark was a faint, indecipherable smudge from a place called Porthgill, Cornwall. The date, however, was starkly clear. October 29, 1882. It was penned by a woman named Sister Agnes, her grandmother's own great-aunt. Elara had known a Sister Agnes existed in her family tree, a footnote in the sprawling genealogy she'd once mapped out of professional curiosity, a woman who had taken vows and faded from the family's narrative. But this letter brought her back in a rush of cold, unsettling life. The handwriting was a frantic, spidery scrawl, words tumbling over each other in their haste to escape the page. "The sky has turned a color I have never known," it began. A bruised purple, heavy with a silence that is louder than any thunder. The sea roars, but here, within the walls of St. Margaret's, the air is dead. The storm has been upon us for 3 days. It has cut us off from the village, from everything. The bridge is gone. We are an island on this cliff, God's forgotten daughters. Elara paused, the chill of the words seeping into her skin. She could almost hear the wind howling, feel the spray of a long-dead storm. She read on. "I write this by the last of the candlelight. Sister Elena weeps in the chapel. The others, they are quiet, too quiet. There are 16 of us here, and I fear this night will be our last. Not from the wind or the waves, but from the silence that came before it. A secret is a heavy stone, and we have carried it for too long. If we are not here when the sun returns, know that we existed. Know that the 16 sisters of St. Margaret's by the Say kept their faith, even when faced with this. Pray for us, pray they find us." The letter ended there, abruptly. No signature beyond the name Agnes woven into the text. 16 sisters, a terrible storm, a secret. Elara felt the familiar thrum of a story that refused to be buried. This was not just a family heirloom. It was a loose thread in the tapestry of history, and her entire career was built on pulling such threads. 2 weeks later, she was in Porthgill. The village was just as the letter had implicitly described. A cluster of granite cottages huddled in a cove, perpetually braced against the Atlantic. The air tasted of salt and damp earth. A constant, mournful wind whipped through the narrow streets, carrying the cries of gulls. It was a place that felt steeped in history, its stones saturated with the memories of sailors lost and storms weathered. Her first stop was the local parish, a newer stone building that had clearly replaced an older one. She found the parish priest, Father Michael, in a small, book-lined office that smelled of floor polish and old paper. He was a man in his late 50s, with a kind face and eyes that seemed weary, as if he'd listened to a lifetime of troubles. "St. Margaret's?" He repeated the name, his brow furrowing in genuine thought. He turned to a large, leather-bound ledger on his desk. An interesting query. Most of the old Catholic orders in this part of Cornwall were consolidated or closed well before the turn of the century. "Let me see." His fingers, surprisingly nimble, traced the lines of faded copperplate script. Elara waited, the letter feeling like a hot coal in her handbag. She had the distinct feeling of being an intruder, of trying to force open a door that had been locked for a reason. "No," Father Michael said finally, looking up with an air of gentle finality. "I have records for a St. Martin's parish, which served the whole area. And there was a small monastery inland, the Benedictines, but they disbanded in the 1850s. There has never been a record of a St. Margaret's convent in the diocesan archives, not in Porthgill, not anywhere on this coast. But the letter," Elara insisted, pulling it carefully from its protective sleeve. It's dated 1882. It's specific. Sent. Margaret's by the sea. He peered at the letter, his expression a mixture of academic interest and practiced skepticism. The paper is certainly of the period. But Sister Agnes, it's not a name in our records of professed nuns for this diocese. Are you certain she wasn't confused? Sometimes, in remote places, local names are given to things. Perhaps it was a convalescent home or a private house that took in ladies of faith. The name might have been an informal one. She mentions 15 other sisters, Alara pressed. 16 women in total. Surely the disappearance of 16 people, nuns or not, would have left a mark. A news report, a police record, something. Father Michael gave her a sympathetic, almost pitying smile. Miss Vance, this was 1882. A storm like the one you describe, they weren't uncommon. People were lost. Records were inconsistent, especially for a small, perhaps unsanctioned, community. If this place existed, and its inhabitants were washed away in a storm, it would have been a tragedy, yes. But it might have been recorded as little more than another casualty of the sea. His explanation was logical. It was reasonable. It was also, Alara felt with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, completely wrong. The tone of the letter wasn't that of a woman fearing a natural disaster. It was fear of something else. The silence that came before it. The church was denying their existence. Not just their deaths, but their very lives. Leaving the parish, Alara stood on the cobbled street, the wind tugging at her coat. The sky, just as Agnes had described, was darkening to a bruised purple over the churning gray water. Across the bay, perched precariously on a jagged headland, stood a set of ruins. They were skeletal, stone teeth biting at the sky, dismissed on the local tourist map as the Seacliff Folly. Father Michael had been polite, his records immaculate, his logic sound. The official story was clear. There was no St. Margaret's. There were no 16 nuns. Sister Agnes was a ghost, her letter a fantasy. But Alara clutched her handbag, the fragile paper within a testament against the official history. She looked from the darkening sky to the distant ruins. A folly, they called it, an absurdity. And perhaps it was absurd to believe a single, frantic letter over a century of official silence. But she was a historian, and she knew that history is full of stories the powerful wish were never told. And she was going to find this one. The conversation with Father Michael left a bitter taste in Alara's mouth, a metallic tang of dismissal that mingled with the salt on the air as she left the village behind. His placid smile and gentle, condescending tone replayed in her mind, fueling a cold fire of determination. A folktale? A misinterpretation? No. The terror in Sister Agnes's letter was too palpable, too real to be a work of fiction. The path to the clifftop was less a path and more a suggestion, a faint trail of compacted earth winding through gorse and heather. The wind, which had been a persistent whisper in Porthgill, grew louder and more insistent with every foot of elevation she gained. It pulled at her coat and whipped strands of hair across her face, a physical manifestation of the resistance she was encountering. Below her, the sea was a turbulent slate gray, its surface agitated by the strengthening gusts. White-capped waves crashed against the jagged black rocks at the base of the cliffs with a percussive boom that seemed to shake the very ground she stood on. The sky was darkening prematurely, a heavy blanket of bruised purple clouds rolling in from the Atlantic, swallowing the pale light of the afternoon. Alara zipped her jacket to her chin, her gaze fixed on the skeletal silhouette of the ruins ahead. The Seacliff Folly, as Father Michael had called it. The name felt like another deliberate slight, a way to diminish its history, to turn a place of sanctuary, and perhaps tragedy, into an architectural joke. As she drew closer, the scale of the structure became apparent. It wasn't a small folly, it was the substantial remains of a large building. Stone walls, thick and formidable, stood like broken teeth against the angry sky. Arched window frames, empty as eye sockets, stared out at the tumultuous sea. What was left of the roof had long since collapsed, leaving the interior exposed to the elements. Ivy clung to the stonework like a shroud, its dark green leaves fluttering madly in the wind. The air grew colder, and a fine, stinging rain began to fall, plastering her hair to her forehead. This was it. This was the place from Agnes's letter. She could feel it in her bones. A profound sense of desolation hung over the stones. Stepping through a collapsed section of wall, Ilara entered the main body of the ruin. The ground was treacherous, a rubble-strewn floor where hardy sea pinks and moss grew in the cracks. She moved slowly, her boots crunching on fallen masonry and loose stones. The wind howled through the empty windows, creating a mournful, flute-like sound that sent a shiver down her spine. It was a symphony of loneliness. She imagined the nuns here, their black habits stark against the gray stone, their lives governed by prayer and the rhythm of the sea. She pictured them on that final night, huddled together, listening to this same wind, this same roaring ocean, as it became their cage and, ultimately, their tomb. She began her search methodically, running her gloved hands over the cold, damp stones of the interior walls. She was looking for anything, a carving, a plaque, a symbol that would defy the church's sanitized history. Most of the surfaces were eroded, worn smooth by more than a century of salt, rain, and relentless wind. Doubt began to creep in, a cold and unwelcome companion. What if Father Michael was right? What if this was just a ruined manor house, its history conflated with local legend over the years? Her resolve wavered for a moment as another, stronger gust of wind nearly knocked her off balance. She braced herself against a low, sturdy section of the outer wall, half sheltered from the now driving rain. Her hand rested on a large cornerstone near the base, mostly obscured by a thick mat of ivy and packed earth. Frustration and a sudden surge of impulse made her pull at the clinging vines. They ripped away with a satisfying tearing sound, revealing the stone beneath. Her heart hammered against her ribs. There was something there. Faint, but unmistakable. Letters carved into the granite. Dropping to her knees, heedless of the mud and damp, she used her fingers to scrape away the remaining dirt and moss. The stone was pitted and worn, but the deep-cut inscription was still legible. Her breath caught in her throat. Convent of St. Margaret's beneath it, a date, Anno Domini 1868. Tears pricked at Ilara's eyes, blurring the inscription. They weren't tears of sadness, but of vindication. A fierce, triumphant joy surged through her, pushing back the cold and the doubt. It was real. They were real. This wasn't a folktale. It was a place, a home, and this stone was its anchor to history. It was irrefutable proof, carved in granite. The church hadn't just lost the records, they had lied. "That's a dangerous game you're playing, lass," a gruff voice shouted over the wind. Ilara gasped and scrambled to her feet, spinning around. An old man stood about 20 yards away, braced against the wind, a scruffy terrier shivering at his heels. He was weathered as the cliffs themselves, his face a road map of wrinkles, a thick wool cap pulled down over his ears. He gestured with a gnarled thumb towards the crumbling archway above her. "This place is hungry. Best not to offer yourself up for supper." Ilara clutched her phone, on which she'd just taken a photo of the cornerstone. "I was just looking," she said, her voice nearly stolen by the wind. The man's eyes, a surprisingly sharp blue, narrowed, flicking from her face to the cornerstone she had just uncovered. He didn't say anything for a moment, his expression unreadable as he took in the exposed inscription. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture that held a world of unspoken meaning. He said, his voice lower now, almost conspiratorial. "Some stones tell tales the living would rather forget." He tugged on his dog's leash. "Storm's getting worse. You'd be wise to get back to the village." Without another word, he turned and began making his way back down the path, his small frame steady against the gale. Ilara watched him go, the encounter leaving her with more questions than answers. But as the rain lashed down, she looked back at the cornerstone. She had her proof. The fight was just beginning. The biting wind and driving rain had become a part of her, no longer an external force, but a chilling presence in her very bones. Ilara stumbled down the muddy path from the cliffs, her phone clutched in her hand like a holy relic. The glowing image on its screen, the chiseled proof of St. Margaret's, was a talisman against the storm and the lies. Each gust of wind seemed to whisper the names of the 16, urging her on, their spectral voices merging with the howl of the gale. She didn't head back to the shelter of her rented cottage. Instead, her boots slapped against the wet cobblestones of Porthgill, carrying her directly toward the stone presbytery beside St. Peter's Church. She didn't bother with the heavy brass knocker, pushing the unlocked door open and stepping inside. Water pooled around her feet on the polished flagstones. Father Michael was sitting in a high-backed armchair before a merrily crackling fire, a book resting in his lap. He looked up, his expression of placid contentment dissolving into one of shock. "Miss Vance, good heavens, child, look at you. You're soaked to the skin. You must have been caught in the worst of it." He started to rise, his face a mask of pastoral concern. "Come, sit by the fire. Let me get you a towel, some tea." "I don't need tea, Father," Elara said, her voice steady and sharp, cutting through his performance. She held up her phone, the screen bright in the firelit gloom. "I need answers." He squinted at the image. The easy smile on his lips tightened. For a moment, a flicker of something unreadable, fear, annoyance, crossed his face before being replaced by a practiced look of thoughtful curiosity. "A cornerstone, how interesting. And where did you find this?" "You know exactly where I found it," she retorted, stepping closer. "It's at the Seacliff Folly, inscribed Convent of St. Margaret's, Anno Domini 1868. You told me the convent never existed. You told me there were no records. Was that simply an oversight, Father, or was it a deliberate lie?" His demeanor changed. The gentle parish priest evaporated, replaced by a stern, guarded official. "Miss Vance, you are making very serious accusations," he said, his tone now cold. "That piece of land has a complicated ownership history. Stones are moved, buildings are repurposed. It proves nothing more than that a stone with that name exists. It proves there was a building there with that name," Elara pressed, her frustration boiling over. "It proves my great-great-aunt wasn't delusional. 16 women lived there. 16 women who disappeared from history. What happened to them that was so terrible the church felt it had to erase their very home from memory?" Father Michael stood to his full height, using his stature to loom over her. "You are meddling in local matters you do not understand. You are stirring up painful old stories that are best left buried in the past. They were people, not stories," she shot back. "They deserve more than to be buried and forgotten. What is the church hiding?" His face was a granite mask. "This conversation is over. The church has nothing to hide. You are trespassing, and I must ask you to leave." He gestured firmly to the door she had entered. There was no room for argument. The wall was not just metaphorical anymore. It was solid, cold, and absolute. Elara turned and walked out, the door closing behind her with a definitive click, shutting out the fire's warmth and leaving her once more in the storm. Her anger was a fire of its own, warding off the cold. There was only one other person who hadn't dismissed her out of hand. Finding the local pub, the Salty Dog, wasn't difficult. Pushing through the heavy door, she was hit by a wave of warmth, laughter, and the smell of stale beer and fried fish. The chatter died as a few patrons, mostly weathered fishermen, looked up at the drenched stranger in their midst. Elara ignored them and went to the bar. "Excuse me," she said to the stocky barman drying a glass. "I'm looking for someone, an older gentleman, tall, with a long gray coat and white hair. I saw him up at the ruins earlier." The barman paused, glancing over at an old man in the corner who slowly lowered his newspaper and gave a slight, knowing nod. "That be Arthur Calloway," the barman said, his voice low. "Keeps to himself. Lives in the last cottage down by the harbor wall, the one with the blue door. Can't miss it." 10 minutes later, she was standing before it. The cottage was exactly as described, a small, slate-roofed building that seemed to brace itself against the sea. Smoke curled from its chimney, a fragile sign of life against the gray sky. She knocked, the sound seeming small against the roar of the waves. After a long moment, the blue door creaked open, and Arthur Calloway's wary eyes peered out. He recognized her immediately, "You," he grunted. "Didn't take my advice then. Told you that place was trouble." "Please," Alara said, her voice earnest, stripped of the anger she'd felt with the priest. "I'm not trying to cause problems. This is personal for me. My great-great-aunt, she was one of them, Sister Agnes." She reached into her waterproof bag and carefully pulled out the fragile, folded letter, holding it out as a peace offering. Arthur's gaze shifted from her face to the old paper. His expression softened, the hard lines around his eyes easing. He looked back at her, a long, assessing stare, then gave a weary sigh and stepped back. Getting out of the wet. The inside of the cottage was cluttered but orderly, smelling of wood smoke, sea salt, and something herbal, like dried lavender. She stood by the small, crackling fire, dripping onto a rug as she explained everything. The letter's contents, the archivist's dead end, Father Michael's denial, and the cornerstone. Arthur listened in silence, his gaze fixed on the flames, his hands resting on his knees. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "The church has a long memory," he said finally, his voice raspy, "and a heavy key for a strong lockbox. They buried that story deep for a reason." He rose slowly and went to a large, dark wood-sea chest in the corner. Kneeling, he lifted the heavy lid and retrieved a rolled-up cylinder of what looked like oilcloth. He laid it on the small table and carefully unrolled it. It was a map, hand-drawn on yellowed parchment, the ink faded but clear. "My great-grandfather drew this, before the official surveys, before the parish records were edited." He pointed a trembling finger at the drawing of the building on the cliff. Next to the main structure, another, smaller wing was sketched, and beside it, 2 words, "Penitent's Wing." Alara stared at the words, a cold dread seeping into her that had nothing to do with the storm. "Penitent's Wing?" Arthur met her eyes, his own filled with a generations-old sadness. "They weren't all nuns, lass, not in the way the books would tell it. The convent, it ran a wing for fallen women. The unwed, the troublesome, the ones whose families had secrets to hide and money to pay for it. They weren't recorded in the census. They weren't on any official register. They were ghosts long before the storm ever came. My own great-grandmother's younger sister, she was one of them." The air in Arthur's small cottage hung thick with the weight of his revelation. The flickering lamplight cast long, dancing shadows across the hand-drawn map, making the stark lines of the penitent's wing seem like a fresh wound on the old parchment. Alara stared at it, her mind racing to recalibrate the entire investigation. It wasn't just a lost convent, it was a secret, a place designed to make people disappear from society long before the storm made them disappear from the world. "So, the official records are useless," Alara said, her voice quiet but firm. "Father Michael isn't just protecting the church from a tragedy, he's protecting it from a scandal. The parish registry, the census data, it would have all been intentionally falsified. These women were meant to be ghosts." Arthur nodded, his gaze distant. He slowly folded the brittle map and placed it back inside a worn leather pouch. "They were. My grandmother used to say there were whispers, you know. Stories you'd hear from the old fishermen about strange deliveries to the convent late at night. Not just food and supplies. Carriages with curtains drawn tight, arriving when the moon was new." He looked at Alara, his eyes filled with a century of inherited sorrow. "We need to find their names, not the nuns, not yet. The penitents. A person isn't real until you can say their name." Alara felt a surge of respect for the old man. His quest was no longer about local lore. It was a deeply personal mission to reclaim a lost piece of his family. But where do we look? If they were erased from official documents, "The church doesn't control everything," Arthur said, a grim resolve hardening his features. "Especially not the dead. The new cemetery by the church is for the respectable folk. But there's an older one, the old parish rest. It's closer to the cliffs, a bit wild now, but it's where they buried people before St. Jude's became the main parish. The records are patchy, and the stones, well, the sea air hasn't been kind. But if these girls died in that storm, and the church wanted to bury them quietly, that's where they'd do it, away from prying eyes." Hope, sharp and clear, cut through Alara's frustration. It was a long shot, but it was a tangible step. "Let's go, now." The wind had picked up again, a low moan that seemed to carry the voices of the past. They walked in silence, Arthur leading the way with a heavy-duty torch that cut a swath through the gathering dusk. The old parish rest was just as he'd described, a forgotten plot of land clinging precariously to the coast. Crooked headstones, shrouded in ivy and stained dark by lichen, jutted from the overgrown grass like broken teeth. The air was heavy with the smell of salt, damp earth, and decay. The only sound was the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below, a constant, mournful percussion. "We're looking for graves from the winter of 1882, Elara stated, her historian instincts taking over. She pulled on a pair of gloves from her coat pocket. "Look for any markers that seem out of place. A cluster of deaths around the same time. Anything unusual." They split up, their torch beams sweeping across the weathered stone. Most of the legible inscriptions were from the early 1800s or even the late 1700s, detailing lives of fishermen and farmers. For nearly an hour, they found nothing. The cold began to seep into Elara's bones, and a familiar sense of futility started to creep in. Maybe Arthur was wrong. Maybe the women were buried in an unmarked mass grave, their identities lost forever. Then Arthur called out, his voice sharp against the wind. "Over here." Elara hurried over to the far corner of the graveyard, an area almost completely consumed by thorny brambles. Arthur was pointing his torch at a low, stone border nearly hidden in the weeds. Behind it was a row of simple, unadorned markers. They were all identical, small, granite slabs, starkly different from the more ornate headstones nearby. They were uniform, almost military in their precision. "This is it," Elara breathed, her heart pounding. "This has to be it." They knelt, using their gloved hands and a stiff brush Arthur had brought to clear away the decades of grime and moss. The first stone they cleared was difficult to read, but as Elara angled her light, letters emerged from the granite. ISOBELM, aged 19-18-82, no surname. No date of birth. No loving epitaph. Just a name, an age, and a year. They moved to the next one. Alice P., aged 17-18-82, and the next. Rose T., aged 21-18-82, one after another, they uncovered the names of the forgotten. Each stone was a quiet testament to a life cut short and deliberately obscured. They were all young women, all dead in the same year. Elara quickly took out her notebook, her pen scratching furiously as she documented each one. They found 12 markers in the row. Arthur worked in grim silence, his movements methodical. He moved to a stone slightly apart from the main row, half swallowed by the roots of a gnarled hawthorn tree. It took both of them to pull the thick, thorny branches away. As Arthur scrubbed at the stone, he let out a choked sound, a sharp intake of breath that was more pain than surprise. Elara shone her torch on the stone. The inscription was clearer than the others, as if sheltered by the tree. ELEONORA CALLOWAY, aged 18-18-82, AT rest AT last. Arthur sank back on his heels, his tough exterior crumbling. He reached out and traced the letters of his family name, a single tear cutting a path through the grime on his cheek. "Eleonora," he whispered, the name a fragile thing in the harsh wind. They didn't even give her a proper marker, but someone made sure our name was on it. He looked up at Elara, his expression a mixture of grief and fierce clarity. "My great-aunt, her sister. She's here. She was real." Elara gave him a moment, the profound sadness of the discovery settling over them. They had found Arthur's family. They had found the penitents. She looked down at her list of names. 12 here, plus Eleonora made 13. She counted again. 13 graves. Then, a chilling thought struck her, recontextualizing everything. She looked from her notebook to the row of stark graves, and then back to the memory of Sister Agnes's letter. "Arthur," she said slowly, her voice barely audible above the sea. "The letter. My ancestor wrote that 16 nuns were lost, but we've only found the graves of 13 penitents. What if we've been looking at this all wrong?" He looked at her, confused. "The church denied the convent existed. The official records are clean. These women, she gestured to the graves, were hidden away. What if the number 16? What if it wasn't the nuns who vanished? What if the nuns in Agnes's letter were actually a code? A way of referring to the penitents without naming them. Maybe there were 16 penitents in that wing, and these 13 are the ones who died in the storm. The real mystery might not be where the nuns went, but who the other 3 penitents were, and if they, somehow, survived. The chilly, damp air of Arthur's cottage clung to them, a persistent echo of the graveyard's gloom. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky the color of slate and streets slick with rain. On the sturdy oak table between them, the list of 13 names felt like a cenotaph, a monument to women deliberately forgotten. Eleonora Calloway, Isabel M. Alice P. Rose T. Each name was a ghost, a question mark. So what now? Elara asked, her voice quiet. She traced a finger over the smudged ink of her notes. We have their names, but names aren't stories. Arthur stared into the cold fireplace, his expression hard. Finding Eleonora's grave had changed him. The local curiosity had sharpened into a personal, bitter-edged quest. Stories are exactly what we need, he said, his gaze shifting to meet hers. The church and their families went to great lengths to erase them. We need to find out why. The Porthgill Heritage Center. It holds the town archives. Births, deaths, census records, old newspapers. It's where we start. The Heritage Center was housed in a former chapel, a small stone building smelling of old paper and beeswax polish. A prim, silver-haired woman named Mrs. Gable peered at them over her spectacles as they entered. Arthur Calloway. It's been a while, she said, her tone polite but guarded. Margaret, Arthur greeted her with a nod. This is Elara Vance. She's a historian researching Porthgill in the late 19th century. We were hoping to look at the census and parish records from around 1882. Mrs. Gable's eyes lingered on Elara. News traveled fast in Porthgill, and a stranger asking questions about the church was bound to cause a stir. 1882, she repeated, a hint of suspicion in her voice. A specific year. Any particular families? Elara decided on a partial truth. We're tracing the histories of several young women from the area. The records seem incomplete. We're just trying to fill in the gaps. Her academic tone seemed to placate Mrs. Gable. With a sigh, she led them to a cramped research room, pointing them toward shelves of heavy, leather-bound ledgers and boxes of microfilmed newspapers. Everything we have from that period is here. Be careful. They're very fragile. The work was painstaking. For hours, the only sounds were the rustle of turning pages and the low hum of the microfilm reader. They divided the list, cross-referencing names with birth registers and the 1881 census. They found them all, recorded as daughters, sisters, living in homes from fishermen's cottages to merchant houses. But in the records after 1881, they vanished. The first break came from the flickering screen of the microfilm reader. Elara leaned forward, her eyes scanning a gossip column in the Porthgill Chronicle from October 1881. It was coy and vicious, typical of the era's journalism. A certain fisherman's lass has learned a harsh lesson about flying too close to the sun. She read aloud. Her dalliance with the son of a prominent merchant has concluded, and we hear she has been sent away for a period of spiritual reflection to mend her wicked ways. Isabel M., Arthur murmured, looking up from a baptismal register. Isabel Morwenna, father John Morwenna, a fisherman. The pieces clicked into place. A public scandal, a powerful family wanting to protect their son's reputation. Isabel was the price. She was sent not to a convent, but to a prison disguised as one. Arthur made the next discovery. Buried in the petty court ledgers, he found the name Rose Trevorrow, aged 17, accused of stealing 3 loaves of bread from the town bakery in January 1882. Look at this, he said, his voice tight with anger. He pointed to a handwritten note in the margin. The charges were dismissed. Below it, a signature from the parish priest of the time, Father Thomas, the predecessor to the man who built the new church. The note read, "The girl has shown true remorse. The parish will take her under its care to ensure her penitence and salvation." Her salvation, Alara repeated, the words tasting like ash. They didn't save her. They buried her. They worked through the names, and a grim mosaic began to form. One girl, from a devoutly religious family, was recorded in a relative's diary as having blasphemous thoughts. Another was the daughter of a widow who had remarried, and her new stepfather simply didn't want her around. Each story was different, but the theme was the same. These were inconvenient women. Women who had loved the wrong person, or spoken out of turn, or were simply poor and powerless. Their sins were not crimes against God, but transgressions against a rigid, unforgiving social order. Hardest to find was Alice Penrose. Her family were wealthy landowners, their name etched on plaques all over town. There was no public scandal, no court record. The clue was subtle, found in a privately published family history book. A single, chilling sentence described the eldest daughter. Alice, ever of a delicate and sensitive disposition, was sent to a private institution in 1882 to recover from a bout of nervous exhaustion. Nervous exhaustion, Arthur scoffed. The Victorian excuse for everything from depression to rebellion. It means they locked her up and threw away the key. As the afternoon light faded, they sat back, surrounded by piles of notes. They had sketched the lives of 13 women, pulling their stories from the shadows. The list on the table was no longer just names. It was Isabel, who fell in love, Rose, who was hungry, Alice, who was perhaps too smart or too sad for her family to tolerate, and Eleonora, Arthur's own lost ancestor, whose crime remained a mystery but whose fate was now agonizingly clear. Alara looked at the original list, then at the letter from Sister Agnes. 16, she said, the number now more ominous than ever. Arthur, we found the stories of the 13 who were buried in that graveyard, but Agnes's letter says 16. 16 souls entrusted to God's mercy. Arthur met her gaze, the shared weight of their discovery settling between them. So who were the other 3? And more importantly, Alara added, a new, urgent theory taking shape. If they weren't in that graveyard with the others, what happened to them? Did they die in the storm and get washed out to sea? Or did they get away? The possibility hung in the air, a sliver of light in the overwhelming darkness. The 13 were victims of a conspiracy. The remaining 3 were a mystery that could change everything. The air in Arthur's small cottage was thick with the ghosts of the past. Stacks of notes and photocopied records lay on the worn wooden table between them, each page a testament to a life cut short. 13 names, 13 tragedies. Alara traced a finger over the name Eleonora Calloway, feeling a pang of sorrow for Arthur, who sat staring into his cold cup of tea, his face a mask of weary grief. They had given these women their stories back, but the silence of the 3 who remained missing was deafening. It's a wall, Arthur said finally, his voice raspy. We've looked through every birth, death, and census record from Porthgill to Truro. The 13 are there, buried under shame and lies. But the other 3, they don't exist. They were scrubbed from history so completely it's as if they were never born. Alara leaned back, the scent of old paper and sea salt filling her senses. She closed her eyes, picturing the scrawled, desperate handwriting of her ancestor. Sister Agnes knew them, she murmured, more to herself than to Arthur. She wrote of 16 souls. She wouldn't have invented them. If the official records are a dead end, we need to look for an unofficial one, a personal one. Her eyes snapped open. Agnes was compassionate. She was trapped in an institution she clearly despised, forced to be complicit in its cruelty. Where would a woman like that keep her truths? Not in the parish archives, where Father Michael's predecessors could find them. She'd hide them somewhere safe, somewhere personal. Arthur looked up, a flicker of understanding in his tired eyes. Where she lived and worked, Alara said, a new energy surging through her. Where she mourned those girls, we have to go back to the convent. This time, their return to the Seacliff Folly was different. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of gorse and salt. The ruins, bathed in the clear morning light, seemed less a place of menace and more a site of quiet remembrance. The collapsed walls and gaping archways were no longer just symbols of decay. They were the last witnesses to the lives lived and lost within them. They worked methodically, leaving the larger, more public spaces of the main hall and focusing on the smaller, more secluded sections that the map had indicated were the living quarters. They ran their hands over stone walls, searching for inconsistencies. They tapped at the flagstone floors, listening for the hollow echo that might betray a hidden space. "We need to think like her," Elara said, standing in the remnants of what looked like a small, private chapel off the main dormitory. The far wall, which would have held the altar, was mostly intact, sheltered by an overhang of rock. She was a woman of faith, but her faith was in people, not in the institution. This would have been her sanctuary. Arthur, ever practical, knelt and began examining the base of the altar structure. He ran his calloused fingers along the seams where the large stones met the floor. "The damp is worst here," he noted. "The water runs down the cliff face behind this wall, but this one stone, see here?" He pointed to a large, flat flagstone directly in front of the altar. "The mortar around it is different, newer maybe, and it's drier than the ones around it." Hope, sharp and sudden, pierced through Elara. Together, they wedged the tips of Arthur's sturdy gardening trowel and a small crowbar he'd brought into the crack. With a great, groaning effort, the stone shifted. It was heavy, and it took their combined strength to lever it up and slide it aside. Beneath it lay not earth, but a shallow cavity. And nestled inside, wrapped in a thick, dark sheet of oilcloth, was a small, rectangular object. Their breath hung in the cool air. Arthur carefully lifted the package out. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. They unwrapped the stiff, cracking oilcloth, which had done its job remarkably well. The damp had not fully penetrated its protective layer. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal. The cover was warped and stained, but intact. On the first page, in elegant, faded ink, were the words, "The Private Journal of Sister Agnes Vance." Elara felt a dizzying connection to the past, as if her ancestor's hand were reaching out across the century. Her hands trembled as she took the journal from Arthur. The pages were fragile, sticking together with age and moisture, but the iron gall ink was still starkly legible. She turned the pages with the utmost care. The early entries were filled with prayers and reflections, but the tone shifted dramatically in the months leading up to the storm. Agnes wrote of her growing horror at the penitent's wing, calling it a prison of shame, not a house of God. She described the cruelty of the Mother Superior and the cold indifference of the visiting church officials. "They treat these girls not as lost sheep, but as stains to be scrubbed away," one entry read. "They punish them for the sins of men, for the crime of poverty, for the simple, human desire to love. I see not penitents, but martyrs." Then, near the end of the journal, they found it. On a page dated just 2 days before the great storm of 1882, Sister Agnes had made a list. The heading read, "My lost girls, may God remember their names, for man will not." Below it were 16 names. Elara read them aloud, her voice shaking. The first 13 matched the headstones in the forgotten graveyard perfectly, and then came the final 3. "Isabel Rosewood," she read, "Clara Beckett, Maeve O'Connell." They had their names. Arthur let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound of both relief and profound sadness. But there was more. Beside the last 3 names, Sister Agnes had added a final, cryptic sentence. "The storm gives what the sea takes. May God guide them past the serpent's jaw." Elara looked up at Arthur, her heart pounding. "The serpent's jaw? What is that?" Arthur's gaze lifted from the journal and looked out past the ruins, towards the jagged coastline stretching south. A slow recognition dawned on his face. "It's a place," he said, his voice low and filled with a new kind of awe. "A local landmark, a treacherous passage between 2 sea stacks shaped like fangs. Sailors avoid it. They say only a fool or a desperate man would try to navigate it." He pointed towards the hazy horizon. It was their escape route. The phrase from Agnes's diary hung in the salty air between them, a final, cryptic breadcrumb. The serpent's jaw. Elara looked at Arthur, whose face, usually etched with a local skepticism, was now sharp with recognition. "I know it," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "It's not on any modern map, not by that name. It's what the old fishermen called a channel just north of here. Two jagged sea stacks that rise from the water like fangs, with a treacherous passage between them. Suicidal to navigate in a storm. But on a calm day, it hides a small cove, barely accessible from the land." A fragile, daring hope began to bloom in Elara's chest. An escape route. The three missing women, Isabel, Clara, and Maeve, hadn't simply vanished into the gale. They had a destination. A desperate, calculated plan. 2 days later, the sea was calm, a sheet of hammered silver under a pale sun. They hired a small, sturdy fishing boat captained by an old salt named Finn, a man whose face was a roadmap of Cornish coastal weather. As they motored out of Porthgales Harbor, the cliffs of the Seacliff Folly looked different, less menacing. Almost serene. Finn pointed a leathery finger towards a distant break in the coastline. "There she be," he grunted. "The Serpent's Jaw caused more than a few wrecks in my grandfather's time." As they drew closer, Elara understood the name. Two enormous, dark spires of rock jutted from the sea, their surfaces slick with black seaweed. The water churned and foamed as it was forced through the narrow gap between them. It looked like the maw of a leviathan. "You want to go through that?" Finn asked, his skepticism evident. "Not through it," Arthur corrected, his eyes scanning the cliff face behind the rocks. Sister Agnes wrote, past the Serpent's Jaw, "Is there anything behind it?" Finn chewed on his lip, expertly maneuvering the boat to hold its position against the current. "There's a little shingle beach. A smuggler's nook," they used to say, almost impossible to see from the sea or land. "You have to know it's there." He guided the boat in a wide arc, navigating past the treacherous fangs. And then Elara saw it. Tucked into an alcove in the cliff, shielded from view by the sea stacks, was a tiny, hidden cove. A sliver of beach, barely large enough for their small boat to land on. It was a perfect hiding place. As their boots crunched onto the damp pebbles, the air grew still and quiet, the roar of the ocean muffled by the surrounding rock. The cove was little more than a scallop shell carved from the cliff, with a shallow sea cave at its rear. A profound sense of reverence settled over Elara. This was the place. This was the final act. They entered the cave. It was dark and damp, smelling of brine and cold stone. Arthur switched on a powerful flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom. The cave was empty, save for a scattering of driftwood and tide-worn stones. For a moment, disappointment washed over Elara. Had they come all this way for nothing? Then Arthur's light caught something. Not a carving on the wall, but something wedged deep within a high crevice just above the high tide line. It was a small, rusted tin box, the kind used for biscuits or tea. Arthur carefully worked it free. It was surprisingly heavy. With trembling hands, Elara took the box. The clasp was rusted shut. Using the edge of a flat stone, Arthur pried it open with a groan of metal. Inside, nestled amongst dried seaweed, was a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle. Elara gently unwrapped it. It contained a small, tarnished silver locket and several folded pages, stiff with age but miraculously preserved from the damp. She unfolded the pages. It was a letter, written in a neat, elegant hand. October 29, 1882, it began. "If this is ever found, let it be known that we chose freedom." Elara's breath caught in her throat. The writing belonged to Isabel Rosewood. The letter detailed their escape with breathtaking clarity. Sister Agnes, horrified by the Mother Superior's cruelty and the deaths of the other girls, had helped them. She had secretly supplied them with food, a small amount of money, and the knowledge of this cove. Maeve O'Connell's brother, a sailor on a merchant vessel, had arranged their passage. He was to meet them here 3 nights after the storm broke, in a boat bound for Bristol, and from there, America. "We do not know what awaits us across the ocean," Isabel wrote, her words a testament to both fear and fierce resolve. "But it cannot be worse than the prison we are leaving. We will carry the memory of our lost sisters, of Eleonora, of all of them, in our hearts. We will live for them, We are no longer penitents. We are Isabel, Clara, and Maeve. And we are free. Ilara opened the locket. Inside was a tiny, faded portrait of a young, stern-looking woman, Isabel's mother, perhaps the very person who had condemned her to St. Margaret's. She had left her past behind, but not its memory. They hadn't been claimed by the sea, they had made it. Back in Porthgill, the weight of the truth felt different. It was no longer just a tragedy, it was a story of survival. Ilara, armed with Agnes's diary and Isabel's letter, wrote a detailed account of her findings. She sent it not to the local parish, but to a national historical journal and the regional diocesan archives, making it impossible to ignore. The church, faced with undeniable evidence, could no longer maintain its silence. Father Michael was quietly reassigned. A formal inquiry acknowledged the existence of the penitent's wing and the tragic events of 1882. Months later, Ilara stood with Arthur on the clifftop, near the ruins of St. Margaret's. The wind was gentle, carrying the scent of salt and wildflowers. Where the forgotten graveyard once lay, there now stood a simple, elegant stone memorial. On it were 16 names, including Eleonora Calloway, Isabel Rosewood, Clara Beckett, and Maeve O'Connell. The inscription read, "For the women of St. Margaret's, remembered at last." Arthur placed a single white rose at the base of the stone. The anger that had fueled him for so long had been replaced by a quiet peace. He had restored his ancestors' name and her dignity. Ilara looked from the memorial out to the vast, endless sea, the very picture of the freedom Isabel and her friends had sought. She had followed a ghost of a story from a 140-year-old letter, and with Arthur's help, had given voice to the silenced. Sister Agnes's desperate plea for remembrance had finally been answered. The 16 were no longer lost to the storm, but etched forever into the history of the Cornish coast. Their story a somber, hopeful testament to the enduring power of truth.